Your remote work is an unauthorized violation. Elena, so pack up and consider yourself terminated, snapped the HR director. Elena didn't argue. She simply forwarded one attachment to corporate audit, a single signed clause from Big Four regulators that turned their smug firing into a multi-million-dollar catastrophe. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Financial Tower was designed to intimidate. Glass partitions swept from floor to ceiling, reflecting the gray horizon of downtown Manhattan, while the faint scent of roasted Arabica and expensive leather lingered in the air. In the high-stakes world of private equity, appearances were everything, and power was measured by the size of your corner office and the coldness of your tone. Sitting on the other side of the high-definition webcam, Richard Hayes, the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, adjusted his gold cufflinks with deliberate slowness. Beside him stood Brad Henderson, the Chief Operating Officer, a man whose entire career was built on taking credit for other people's labor while deflecting blame onto subordinates. For 3 straight weeks, Elena Vance had been working remotely from her quiet apartment, pulling 16-hour shifts to repair the catastrophic data pipeline glitches left behind by Brad's favored offshore contractors. Without her intervention, the upcoming $12 million enterprise acquisition by a consortium of European investors would have collapsed under the weight of compliance errors. She had saved the firm from an embarrassing public failure, working through weekends and burning through endless cups of black tea. Yet, as she looked at the 2 men staring at her through the Zoom window, there was no gratitude in their eyes, only predatory opportunity. Richard leaned closer to his microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. He explained that her remote presence was a direct breach of company policy, an unauthorized deviation from office protocols, and that her immediate termination was effective as of 9:30 that morning. Brad folded his arms, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his lips, declaring that her accrued annual bonuses would be completely forfeited to offset administrative damages. They had orchestrated this entire farce to save $200,000 in performance payouts, assuming a mid-level compliance specialist would simply burst into tears and quietly sign the severance agreement. They truly believed they had executed a masterclass in corporate domination, completely unaware that they had just pulled the pin on a live grenade. Elena did not scream. She did not plead, nor did her hand shake as she rested her fingers above the keyboard. Instead, she took a slow, measured sip of her chamomile tea, looking directly into the camera with an unsettling, crystal-clear tranquility. In the hyper-competitive ecosystem of corporate finance, men like Richard and Brad relied on fear and surprise to paralyze their victims. But panic was an emotion reserved for those who lacked leverage. Elena possessed something far more dangerous than anger. She held the precise legal documentation that dictated the terms of the company's existence for the next 48 hours. 6 months prior, when the firm initiated its massive restructuring deal, Kpmg had insisted on a strict third-party audit clause to guarantee regulatory compliance. As the sole senior architect capable of navigating both legacy data structures and Big Four auditing standards, Elena's explicit authorization had been written directly into the master agreement. Her name was not merely on a standard HR employment contract. It was hard-coded into Section 12B of the binding financial charter required by the federal regulators. To remove her without a 90-day transition period and a signed regulatory waiver was legally equivalent to detonating the acquisition itself. With a single, quiet click, Richard terminated the Zoom call, smirking as Elena's box vanished from the screen. He turned to Brad, dusting off his hands with a triumphant laugh, believing he had successfully slashed overhead and secured his own end-of-year kickbacks. In the main executive boardroom, champagne bottles were already chilling in silver buckets, waiting for the celebratory toast once the Kpmg audit team arrived at 11 o'clock. The executive board was preparing to sign off on the $12 million deal, oblivious to the fact that the digital foundation beneath their feet was rapidly disintegrating. Sitting in her sunlit living room, Elena calmly opened her secure personal portal. She attached a single, cryptographically signed PDF, the original Big Four Oversight Covenant, and addressed an email to the lead partner at Kpmg, copying the chairman of the board. Attached was a simple, three-word note detailing her immediate, involuntary dismissal by HR. As she pressed send, the automated internal access controls triggered instantly across the company's private cloud network, revoking all active security keys associated with her credentials, exactly as dictated by federal security protocols. Down at Meridian Tower, the atmosphere in the executive suite shifted from smug celebration to sheer, unadulterated panic in a matter of seconds. Monitors across the trading floor began flashing amber warning banners as data synchronization froze midstream. In the boardroom, Richard's smartphone began buzzing relentlessly, the screen illuminating with the caller ID of the senior managing director of Kpmg. He raised his hand to quiet the room, answering with his usual rehearsed charm, totally unprepared for the icy, razor-sharp voice on the other end of the line. The lead auditor didn't even bother with a greeting, his tone sharp enough to cut through steel. He demanded to know why the company's primary compliance key had suddenly gone offline, effectively freezing the $12 million escrow funds and invalidating the entire morning audit report. Richard's face drained of color as he stammered through an explanation about a routine staffing adjustment. But the auditor wasn't listening to excuses. He was staring at the binding contract clause that Richard had failed to read, realizing that the corporate empire was about to be brought to its knees by the very woman they had just thrown out the door. Yet, as bad as the frozen fund seemed at that moment, Richard had no idea that Elena's next move would expose a hidden multi-million-dollar liability that would make the lost acquisition look like pocket change. The silence that blanketed the executive boardroom at Meridian Financial Tower was deafening, broken only by the nervous, rhythmic clicking of Brad Henderson's Mont Blanc pen. On the wall-mounted interactive display, the green status indicators for the $12 million acquisition had turned a blinding, violent shade of crimson. Across the mahogany table, the firm's managing director was glaring at Richard Hayes with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Richard, whose face had flushed to the color of a bruised plum, was frantically trying to swipe through his digital HR portal, only to find himself locked out of Elena's employee file entirely. The system had automatically archived her records under federal regulatory protection the moment her security token was revoked, sealing her file behind three-factor cryptographic authentication that required the lead auditor's personal clearance. Before Richard could stammer out a coherent lie, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with an aggressive thud. Marcus Sterling, the senior lead partner from Kpmg, walked in, flanked by two corporate attorneys carrying thick, black leather-bound binders. Sterling didn't bother taking a seat, nor did he offer the customary pleasantries. He tossed a heavy document onto the center of the table, the metallic clatter echoing against the high ceiling. He demanded to know who had authorized the immediate dismissal of their primary regulatory officer without providing the mandatory 90-day advance notice to the Federal Oversight Board. Brad stood up, attempting to deploy his usual corporate charm, explaining that Elena was merely a difficult worker who had abused remote work privileges during her probation period. But Sterling shut him down with a single, icy glare that froze the blood in Brad's veins. "You complete idiots," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low, stripped of any corporate civility. "Elena Vance isn't just a compliance architect on your payroll. Under Section 12B of our binding underwriting agreement, she was designated as the sole independent custodian of your risk mitigation algorithms. Her personal digital signature is the literal cryptographic key that certifies your financial health to our European investors. Without her active clearance token online, every single dollar sitting in that $12 million escrow account is frozen by federal statute. But it gets worse, Brad. Much worse. Sterling opened the binder to a highlighted page, tapping his pen against a specific subclause that Richard had carelessly skimmed through 3 months ago. When Elena had signed her original contract, she had insisted on a standard regulatory indemnification clause, a routine safeguard designed to protect internal whistleblowers and audit leads from corporate retaliation. The clause explicitly stated that if Elena was terminated without prior regulatory consent, the firm's $50 million errors and omissions insurance policy would instantly be nullified for all past, present, and ongoing transactions she had audited over the last 2 years. By firing her to save $200,000 in performance bonuses, HR had effectively stripped the entire firm of its legal and financial body armor. The air in the boardroom turned frigid as the realization hit the room like a physical blow. If you are enjoying this battle of wits between corrupt corporate suits and a brilliant professional who knows her rights, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing your own stories of office justice. The managing director turned slowly toward Brad, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the conference table. The offshore data restructuring that Brad had personally overseen and claimed as a massive cost-saving triumph was now completely uninsured, exposed to immediate, unscrutinized inspection by federal regulators. Desperate to contain the spreading firestorm, Brad grabbed his personal smartphone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Elena's private cell number. He listened to the agonizingly long ring, praying that she would answer so he could offer her an immediate reinstatement, a full remote work allowance, and double her original bonus payout. But the call went straight to an automated voicemail message, her calm, measured voice informing the caller that she was currently unavailable and that all official regulatory inquiries should be directed to the Federal Oversight Board. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, sitting on the sunlit terrace of an upscale corner bistro, Elena took a slow, deliberate bite of her buttery croissant. On her personal laptop screen, a sleek terminal window displayed real-time network diagnostics of the firm's private cloud infrastructure. She watched as the automated security protocols she had designed months ago executed with flawless precision. But Elena wasn't just sitting back to watch them squirm over the frozen escrow funds. She was patiently waiting for the 11 o'clock system heartbeats to trigger an automatic cross-reference audit across the firm's secondary offshore ledger. What Richard and Brad had failed to realize was that Elena's 16-hour remote work shifts weren't spent merely fixing routine data pipeline glitches. While repairing the offshore code, she had uncovered a hidden, highly sophisticated trail of $4.5 million in diverted funds, systematically rerouted through shell accounts managed by Brad's personal contractors. She had quietly isolated the fraudulent transactions, embedding an automated trigger into the master compliance protocol that would remain dormant as long as her administrative credentials remained active. But the exact second HR executed her illegal termination, that dormant trigger activated, setting off an unstoppable countdown that was about to deliver a fatal blow to Brad's entire career. As the clock on the wall ticked toward 11, the executive board had no idea that the lost $12 million deal was the absolute least of their worries, because the next automated alert would bring the federal authorities straight to their doorstep within the hour. The minute hand on the boardroom's brushed steel clock clicked forward to 11 o'clock exact. Inside the executive suite of Meridian Financial Tower, the air had grown so heavy and oppressive that every breath felt like inhaling liquid lead. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, a sudden torrential rain began to sweep across the Manhattan skyline, battering the windows with a persistent, rhythmic hiss that seemed to mock the rising panic inside. Richard Hayes stood frozen beside the marble coffee station, a paper cup dripping lukewarm espresso onto his polished leather shoes, completely oblivious to the stain. Across the table, Brad Henderson was sweating profusely. His silk tie loosened at the collar as his trembling hands frantically refreshed his laptop screen, praying for a system recovery that was never going to come. Precisely at 11, the wall-mounted interactive display didn't reboot into its standard corporate dashboard. Instead, the screen flickered violently once before plunging into a high-contrast terminal layout reserved exclusively for emergency regulatory events. A deep, mechanical tone echoed from the boardroom's surround sound speakers as a series of automated forensic scripts executed across the firm's distributed ledger. Lines of glowing amber code scrolled downward at breakneck speed, cross-referencing every transactional log, internal routing protocol, and off-balance sheet entry processed over the past 18 months. Marcus Sterling leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he gripped the edge of the conference table. The Kpmg lead partner didn't say a word, but his posture shifted instantly from corporate irritation to lethal focus. On the main monitor, the automated script isolated a series of recurring wire transfers, 72 distinct payments totaling $4.5 million, all routed through an obscure offshore vendor registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Meridian Analytics, LLC. Beneath the vendor profile, highlighted in bright, uneditable crimson, was the digital approval hash. It wasn't Elena's signature. It was Brad Henderson's personal executive authorization code, time-stamped and cryptographically verified. A suffocating silence descended upon the room, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. The managing director's eyes slowly drifted from the screen toward Brad, his expression transforming into something cold, terrifying, and utterly merciless. Brad's jaw worked silently, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost standing in a $3,000 suit. He stumbled backward half a step, pointing a shaking finger at the screen as he stammered that it was a mistake, an old database artifact, a malicious script injected by Elena to frame him after her termination. "Don't insult my intelligence, Brad," Marcus Sterling cut in, his voice ringing out like a gavel striking polished granite. "That isn't a third-party hack. That is an automated forensic failsafe embedded directly into your primary compliance architecture. While you were busy trying to force her out to save a couple $100,000 in bonuses, Elena Vance was working 16-hour days mapping out your fraudulent funnel. As long as her primary clearance key remained active, her custom script held those discrepancies in a secure quarantine vault, giving your internal audit committee a chance to fix the compliance gap quietly. But the moment HR revoked her credentials, her automated protocol recognized an unauthorized system breach and immediately forwarded the unredacted forensic ledger straight to our server and to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Meanwhile, from miles away at a quiet corner bistro in Soho, the gentle hum of morning jazz played softly over the outdoor speakers. Rain pattered against the green canvas awning under which Elena sat, wrapped in a comfortable cashmere scarf. She reached down, took a slow, deliberate sip of her warm Earl Grey tea, and watched a tiny green status bar on her laptop turn into a solid, verified checkmark. There was no malice on her face, no triumphant smirk, only the profound, undisturbed peace of an expert who had built a flawless machine and watched it perform exactly as designed. She closed her laptop lid with a soft click, placed it neatly into her leather briefcase, and pulled out her favorite paperback book. Back in the boardroom, absolute chaos erupted. Richard Hayes dropped his coffee cup onto the Persian rug, clutching his head as he realized that as the senior VP of Human Resources, he had signed off on the immediate termination without conducting the mandatory compliance check, making him legally liable as an active co-conspirator under federal corporate governance statutes. He turned on Brad like a cornered animal, screaming at him for dragging the entire HR division into a criminal cover-up. The managing director didn't even bother to stop them. He pulled out his private satellite phone, his voice shaking as he instructed his executive assistant to cancel all upcoming investor calls and summon the firm's chief criminal defense counsel immediately. Before the assistant could even acknowledge the order, the boardroom desk phone rang with an urgent, piercing double tone. The caller ID displayed the high-priority emergency line of the Federal Financial Oversight Bureau. Marcus Sterling looked around the room at the ruined executives, buttoned his suit jacket with calm precision, and answered the call on speaker. The voice on the line was clipped, formal, and devastatingly direct, announcing that a federal regulatory hold had been placed on all firm assets, and an emergency investigative team was already in transit to the building. Brad sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, realizing that his career, his reputation, and his freedom were disintegrating in real time. The firm was now completely frozen, paralyzed by the very system they thought they controlled, helpless against the mountain of evidence Elena had left behind. But as bad as the federal raid seemed, the executive board was about to discover an even more horrifying reality. The only legal mechanism capable of lifting the freeze and preventing complete corporate bankruptcy was locked behind an encryption key that belonged to one person alone, and she had just put her phone on Do Not Disturb. The glass doors of the Meridian Financial Tower's 42nd floor didn't merely open. They were held wide as a team of 5 federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Enforcement Division stepped onto the polished Italian marble, their dark suits and formal badge lanyards striking a stark, chilling contrast against the sleek corporate luxury of the reception lounge. The ambient noise of the trading floor, the low hum of background chatter, the rhythmic clicking of mechanical keyboards, the soft chime of incoming market feeds, instantly died. It was replaced by a suffocating, heavy stillness that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. In the main boardroom, Richard Hayes stood paralyzed near the tinted glass windows, watching through the partition as 2 junior compliance officers were ordered to step away from their workstations while agents began attaching physical encryption blocks to the primary server racks. Brad Henderson was slump-shouldered in his executive leather chair, staring blankly at his silver-plated desk clock, his mind frantically searching for a loophole in the non-disclosure agreements and indemnity contracts he had forced Elena to sign during her initial onboarding. But the law, unlike corporate politics, was not susceptible to bluster, empty threats, or executive intimidation. The firm's managing director, Arthur Vance, stood at the head of the conference table, his knuckles turning chalk white as he listened to the harsh, unfiltered voice of Lord William Harrington, the managing partner of the European Investor Consortium, broadcasting through the high-definition boardroom speakers. Harrington was not calling from a lavish corporate suite in London. He was speaking directly from a private jet parked on a wet tarmac in Zurich, and his tone was stripped of every single ounce of diplomatic subtlety. "Let me make sure I understand the absolute absurdity of this catastrophe, Arthur," Harrington said, his voice echoing off the acoustic oak panels with the weight of an iron sledgehammer. "You allowed a mid-level human resources bureaucrat and a failed chief operating officer to unilaterally terminate the sole legally designated custodian of our risk mitigation protocols just hours before a $12 million closing window, a woman whose explicit, unredacted signature is required under Section 12B of our binding international regulatory covenant? Are you running an institutional private equity firm or a chaotic amateur circus?" Richard attempted to step forward, cleared his throat with a dry rasp, and offered a weak, trembling defense about strict corporate remote war policies, internal security protocols, and mandatory probationary period compliance. But Harrington didn't even allow him to finish his sentence. "Shut your mouth, Richard," Harrington snapped, the static on the satellite line crackling with raw venom. Your absurd internal policies aren't worth the paper they're printed on when they blatantly violate federal oversight frameworks. You thought you were saving $200,000 in performance bonuses and protecting your own bloated administrative budget. Instead, you have invalidated our entire $50 million errors and omissions insurance policy, triggered an automatic federal forensic audit, and frozen $12 million in escrow funds. If those funds are not unlocked by 5 o'clock today, our syndicate will proceed with immediate clawback proceedings, enforcing personal financial liability claims against every executive officer who signed off on her unlawful dismissal. While the executive floor of Meridian Tower descended into an unmitigated nightmare of emergency legal filings, frantic phone calls to high-priced criminal defense attorneys, and weeping HR assistants scrambling to retrieve archived employment files, Elena Vance sat in the quiet, sunlit sanctuary of the city library's upper reading room. Light filtered softly through the high, arched glass windows, illuminating the yellowed pages of a rare architectural history volume she had been meaning to read for months. Her personal smartphone, resting beside a lukewarm porcelain cup of jasmine tea, vibrated silently against the dark mahogany table. On the screen, a relentless, frantic parade of notifications scrolled past. 17 missed calls from the managing director's direct line, 9 urgent text messages from Brad offering an immediate reinstatement with triple her original performance bonus, and 4 high-priority emails from the lead partner at Kpmg. Elena didn't touch the phone. She didn't smirk, nor did she feel a petty surge of vindictive pleasure. She simply took a smooth, brass bookmark, placed it carefully between the pages of her book, and took a slow, measured sip of her tea. In the realm of high-stakes corporate finance, power was never truly held by the executives who occupied the largest corner offices or drove the most expensive sports cars. Real power resided entirely with the architect who understood the underlying structural foundation. When Richard and Brad had executed her dismissal, they had operated under the arrogant assumption that an employee was merely an interchangeable cog in a machine they owned. They had completely failed to comprehend that Elena had not merely worked for the firm. She had constructed their entire digital compliance framework under a specialized third-party consultation agreement that granted her exclusive intellectual property rights over the custom cryptographic validation algorithms. Her remote work setup had never been an unauthorized breach of internal policy. It had been an explicit, hard-coded contractual prerequisite designed specifically to maintain her status as an independent, uncorrupted regulatory custodian free from internal corporate coercion. By firing her, they hadn't just removed a worker. They had legally severed the company's access to its own regulatory engine, effectively locking themselves out of their own vault while the federal authorities stood at the gates. Back in the boardroom, the lead federal investigator laid out a crisp, official document onto the center of the conference table, right over Brad's abandoned Montblanc pen. Under Section 404 of the Federal Financial Accountability Act, the agent announced calmly, his steady gaze scanning the pale, sweating faces around the table. All trading permissions, corporate wire transfers, and internal accounting modifications across this firm are officially suspended until the designated regulatory officer submits a cryptographically verified clearance token. If you attempt to override this system freeze manually, or if you attempt to alter any digital logs associated with Ms. Vance's remote access history, every individual involved will face immediate criminal charges for destruction of federal evidence. Brad sank deeper into his chair, burying his face in his hands as a cold sweat soaked through his tailored shirt collar, realizing that his fraudulent offshore shell accounts were now permanently exposed to federal scrutiny with zero chance of concealment. The managing director turned slowly toward Richard, his dark eyes burning with a silent, devastating rage that made the room instantly drop several degrees in temperature. "Find her," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of panic and absolute desperation. I don't care if you have to walk to her apartment on foot in the pouring rain. I don't care if you have to offer her my office, a senior partnership seat, and $1 million retention bonus on the spot. If Elena Vance does not walk through those front doors and sign that regulatory waiver before the European Consortium pulls out at 5 o'clock, I will personally ensure that both of you spend the next 10 years answering federal subpoenas in court. But as Richard reached for his suit jacket with shaking fingers, his phone buzzed with a high-priority notification from the chairman of the board. A brief, brutal memo confirming that an emergency board meeting had been convened for 4 o'clock, with a single item on the formal agenda: the immediate cause-based termination and asset freeze of both the senior vice president of HR and the chief operating officer. By 4:15 that afternoon, the rain outside the Meridian Financial Tower had softened into a persistent gray drizzle, casting a cold, metallic sheen over the brass and marble lobby. Up on the 42nd floor, the once glamorous executive suite felt less like a hub of global finance and more like a crime scene undergoing forensic extraction. The emergency board meeting, called by the chairman, had lasted less than 12 minutes. There were no lengthy deliberations, no formal debates, and certainly no appeals for mercy. Richard Hayes and Brad Henderson stood in the center of the mahogany boardroom, surrounded by board members whose faces were carved from solid granite. The chairman didn't even look them in the eyes as he signed the official board resolution. In a single, crisp motion, both men were stripped of their executive titles. Their equity packages were canceled under cause-based termination covenants, and their corporate access cards were rendered utterly useless. As two uniformed private security officers stepped into the room to escort them from the premises, federal agents stood waiting by the glass elevators with formal grand jury subpoenas in hand. Brad's frantic attempt to shift the blame onto Elena had completely evaporated. His personal signatures on the offshore shell transfers were now part of an active federal indictment. Richard, trembling as he clutched a cardboard box containing his desk items, looked down the long corridor toward the executive lobby, realizing that his 30-year career in corporate human resources had ended not with a lucrative severance package, but with a public, irreversible disgrace. At 4:35, 25 minutes before the European Investment Syndicate's absolute deadline, a black luxury sedan pulled up smoothly to the curb outside the glass facade of the city library. Inside the quiet reading room, Elena Vance calmly closed her notebook, placed her brass bookmark into her history volume, and smoothed down the lapels of her dark silk blazer. She was not summoned. She was invited as an independent master consultant. When the chairman of the board and Lord William Harrington had finally managed to reach her through her external legal counsel, there were no condescending instructions, no demands for obedience, and no threats of contract violations. The tone from the top of the corporate pyramid had undergone a profound, seismic shift. They were not treating her as a replaceable mid-level compliance specialist anymore. They were addressing the single person who held the master key to a $12 million acquisition and the future survival of the firm. The private conference room at the Waldorf, where the emergency signing was arranged, was bathed in a warm, golden light of crystal chandeliers. Across the polished oak table sat the chairman of the board, the lead partner from Kpmg, and Lord Harrington joining via a secure, high-definition video link. Elena walked into the room with an unshakable, silent grace, taking her seat with the deliberate calm of a seasoned diplomat entering peace talks. She laid out her terms, drafted not in anger or spite, but with surgical precision by her personal legal team, to restore the cryptographic compliance clearance and unlock the frozen escrow funds. The firm would first execute a complete, unreserved public retraction of her termination, citing an administrative error by former HR management. Furthermore, her employment status was permanently restructured into an independent, high-value consulting agreement, backed by a 3-year retainer at double her previous compensation, complete with absolute veto power over all risk mitigation and audit protocols. The firm was also required to fully cover her legal fees and issue a formal written apology signed by the entire executive board. The chairman didn't hesitate for a single second. With the clock ticking down to 4:52 p.m., his fountain pen glided across the parchment, signing every single page of her new agreement without a single word of pushback. Lord Harrington inclined his head through the screen, a look of profound respect in his sharp eyes, as he formally commended Elena for her uncompromising integrity and brilliant engineering of the risk framework. Elena took her custom encrypted security token from her briefcase, plugged it into the secure terminal provided by the Kpmg auditor, and entered her multi-factor authorization key. In an instant, across the international financial network, the glowing crimson warning banners vanished. The $12 million escrow funds were released, the European acquisition was legally validated, and the system returned to full operational status. An hour later, as the evening skyline of Manhattan illuminated with millions of twinkling lights, Elena stepped out onto the avenue, feeling the crisp, refreshing night air against her face. Behind her, in the glittering towers of Midtown Finance, corrupt executives were facing the immediate, devastating consequences of their own arrogance, learning the hard lesson that titles and corner offices mean nothing when stacked against ironclad contracts, flawless competence, and absolute legal truth. She smiled softly, adjusting her scarf as she walked down the street toward a quiet dinner, completely in control of her work, her life, and her future.